AS9100 becoming IA9100 is not just a naming update anymore. And now there's another layer, ISO 9001 2026. The final draft is moving through ballot. IA9100 is expected to follow that foundation, and aerospace companies are trying to figure out whether they are facing one transition, two transitions, or just a whole lot of noise. Today, we have Mike Varney back on the QT9Qcast to help us separate what is known, what is still speculative, and what companies should start to do now. So in our first episode, one of the clearest points that you made was that product safety in AS9100 does not mean worker safety necessarily. Of course, worker safety matters, but product safety in this context is about the safe operation of the completed product. So what I wanted to dig into today is the newer detail. You know, your summary says IA9100 is expected to strengthen the product safety framework with hazard identification, safety risk analysis and control, managing change impacts on safety, safety training and awareness, communication of safety critical information, reporting safety events, even anonymous employee reporting for safety hazards. What, if anything, has become clearer around product safety since our initial discussion?
So product safety, and I know we talked a little bit about this before, this threw a lot of people for a loop in Rev D, because product safety, of course, we want our employees to be safe. Of course, we don't want, workplace accidents. Product safety does not care at all about those topics. That is a separate requirement. I'm not saying it's not important, but that's not what this is about, right? This is about the safe use of the product in the field, that the product was built to meet the requirements, that the product can be safely used by whoever is the call it end user, end operator, of whatever that product is. So, some of the things have become a little more clear. A lot of companies may ask, well, I have no design authority. So what impact do I have on product safety? I didn't design it. I'm just building it to print. And, that's the case for a lot of the organizations out there. The vast majority of AS9100 companies take exclusion to clause 8.3, design and development. So most companies are in that boat. So when we talk about product safety, it's about building to the print. It's about if there's any confusion about the requirements from the customer, it's getting that clarification and retaining evidence of that communication trail. If there is something that happens to the product during its production, for example, you're using a forklift to move it, it slips off the pallet, hits the floor, looks okay, but we're not really sure because we don't know the end use. That would be a situation where we want to document that event, communicate that with the customer, say, hey, we had an incident, it still meets the spec. What do you want us to do? We don't have design authority. We may not even know what the product is used for in the end. So we need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to do everything that we can to think about that person on the tail end, right? Think about that person who's installing that part in an aircraft, the person that's using that part in a defense environment, however that product may or may not be used. And again, if we don't know the answer to the end use of the product, assume that everything that we do to it that goes against our best practices or goes against the prints of the requirement is a risk to its safety, and clarification should be gained.
Now, does every company need a standalone product safety risk register, or can this information live inside existing risk or nonconformance or CAPA or change control processes?
So I don't think most companies will need an actual, log to keep track of this stuff, right? I think if you have a good system in place, if you have a strong QMS, the QMS already has the tools in place to be able to address this. We talk about things like, risk controls, reviewing customer requirements, customer communication, identification of potential non-conforming events, your methodology or your tools in place to escalate events. Those things should be able to handle product safety. I think if we're talking about organizations that have design authority, that's going to look a little bit different. I'm focusing primarily on build to print with my examples here, but if you have design authority, I expect that'll be a little bit more robust because you will know more about the design of the product, the use of the product, what is acceptable and what isn't, right? So maybe instead of having that customer communication to say, hey, we had a potential event, that communication may be with your engineering department. Rather than communicating with the customer. You may say, hey, to our engineers, we had an incident. You guys designed the product. Do you know if this has potential impact? And you can rely on both internal and external tools for those answers.
That's a good response. Ultimately, a company may already have risk management and change control, training, nonconformances, Kappa. Like you said, these tools already exist. Companies already utilize them. The improvement is more making sure product safety is visibly considered within those processes, not creating like a giant new red tape and bureaucracy to stumble through. And so, something that we teased on in the last part was counterfeit parts and sub-tier controls. So how would you turn those requirements for counterfeit parts and sub-tier supplier requirements into practical supplier quality guidance? Clause 8 is where your summary says most audit depth may increase, again, with product safety, counterfeit prevention, sub-tier control, and disciplined planning. But for counterfeit parts, the expected emphasis includes counterfeit awareness training, obsolescence monitoring, authorized sourcing, traceability to original source, counterfeit detection, external alert monitoring, and segregation and reporting of suspect parts. Where should companies start if they have a basic counterfeit prevention procedure, but not much evidence behind it?
That is a great question. Most companies, the counterfeit part requirement right now is in clause 814. A lot of companies will delegate that responsibility to procurement, materials purchasing, whatever you call that department in your organization, which historically handles clause 8.4. So usually when we're looking at pairs for purchasing, it's very common that we will see the clauses evaluated on that pair would be 814 and 84. They often get tied together, even though they're technically in different sections of the standard. I would expect now that we are going to need to see more than just we have an approved supplier list, right? That's always the default. Well, we only buy from approved sources. It's like, well, that is great. However, one follow-up question that I like to ask my clients in an audit environment is, okay, we have an approved supplier list. That's great, but some of your approved suppliers are distributors. Okay. Distributors have a completely separate risk inherently because they are sourcing from all sorts of different places, and who you get your material from this week might be different than who you get your material from next week, even though they're coming from the same distributor. You see that on your mill cert, right? Your mill cert may say this mill this week and a different mill next week. So more than just saying, we're only buying from our approved sources, I expect that what we're going to need to prove now going forward is that once we receive product in, that we're actually evaluating the documentation that comes with that product, right? We receive a mill cert, if we're buying from a distributor, we get a mill cert from the actual mill that made the material and sold to the distributor. We need to be evaluating those certs as well with a level of scrutiny that's probably a little bit higher than we have been in the past. There's some things that are higher risk than others. Raw material, hardware, and electronics are the three most likely areas that we see non-conforming or counterfeit events generally, historically. So we're going to want to make sure that when we're buying these products, that the documentation is actually reviewed. We may expect to see some requirements for third-party testing on product, maybe not as a blanket requirement, but that may become kind of common practice with raw material. There's some great tools out there now. We have XRF machines now, which were very new to market 10 years ago, that are able to do chemical analysis on properties of material live on the spot. Those are great tools that a lot of people are starting to integrate. But ultimately, those tools need to go a step further than just it's purchasing's responsibility.
Absolutely. It's a little bit different from just buying from an approved suppliers list and actually, proving that counterfeit risk is controlled.
Exactly.
What does sub-tier control mean in plain language?
So sub-tier control generally refers to, any vendor that you're relying on as critical in your production of a part. So for example, if you are making product, and one of the requirements from your customer is that it's a heat treated part. You machine the product, you may machine it final, and then that product goes out to get heat treated. That is a sub process, right? You sent that out to somebody else. We have great control. We have an awesome QMS. We know that everything is rock solid here in our facility. Where that falls apart is when it leaves our facility, right? Do I know that ABC heat treating is following, a quality management system, following the same practices, the same quality culture and ethical behavior that we are up to our standards? And the answer isn't always yes. It's often we don't know, and that's the reality of it. This becomes even higher risk when we start talking about things like subcontract manufacturing. There's a lot of companies out there, we see it now, where, hey, when they hit their capacity, of their internal capabilities, they start subbing jobs out as a
Mm-hmm.
business decision, right? And that's not a bad business decision, but there's an inherent risk there. Because if you just
Yeah.
call a machine shop down the street and say, hey, I'm at capacity, can you run a couple jobs for me? And they run a couple jobs for you, you send them back, they come back to your facility, you do your final inspection CFC and ship the product out. Other than your CFC and your final inspection at the end, we don't really know a whole lot what happened to that product upstream,
Mm-hmm.
and not just as it pertains to counterfeit parts, but also as it pertains to things like ethical behavior, product safety, right? Did someone there drop the product? If they dropped the product, did they follow, the same things that we would have followed to verify that that's still potentially a safe product to use in the field? And often the answer is we're not sure.
How can smaller companies avoid turning this into an impossible supplier policing project?
That is a great question. And this comes up all the time. There's a few ways you can do it. There's some are more manageable than others. There's a lot of companies now that are starting to blanket flow down the requirements for ISO 9001 or AS 9100 compliance, and of special processing then requiring NADCAP. That's pretty good. If we're doing that, we know that a CB has vouched for the organization, saying that they are meeting at least the minimum requirements of the standard that they're certified to. Of course, there are companies out there that cherry pick data and make themselves present well in an audit environment. And as soon as the auditor leaves, everything falls apart. Those companies exist. Of course they do. There's not a whole lot that we can do about that, unfortunately. There are some companies that are also still doing on-site audits of their suppliers, especially their higher risk suppliers. That went away for a while, and we're starting to actually see a resurgence of that, which is kind of interesting. During COVID era, a lot of companies said, we're not doing that anymore. There's high risk to it. It's gotten very expensive with the COVID thing going on. It was very challenging to do it. Since that period of time, since call it 23, 24, we've started to see those ramp back up, which is kind of interesting because when you have that face-to-face interaction, that accountability increases,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to see things that, because you're there not as an auditor, you're there as a customer or a supplier, right? Depending on where you are in your supply chain here, you may see things with a different light than the auditor that came in that issued the certificate may have seen it. So there's some value there too. Again, I'm not saying that should be a default answer to everybody. If you have 200 suppliers and they're all over the world, I'm not telling you to bankrupt your company by getting on a plane and going out and visiting everybody. But I think having regular communication, for the higher critical suppliers, higher risk suppliers, to require a quality management standard or a quality management system that is certified to 9001, 9100, 1345, NADCAP, whatever it might be, whatever's applicable, is a great way to start. It's impossible to be 100% rock solid unless we live at that organization.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a lot of tools we can put in place to minimize that risk, right? We come back to that risk mitigation discussion.
Absolutely. Kind of the way I'm kind of summarizing is the message is not necessarily that every aerospace supplier now needs to audit every supplier's supplier. It's more the message is that companies need a risk-based way to decide how much control is appropriate. How the requirements
That's
are flowed
100% it.
down, what's critical.
And
And
that is subjective to some extent, and that's okay. But what I expect that we're gonna see our auditors asking is have we evaluated the criticality of some of these suppliers, and what are the high risk suppliers required to do per your requirements, right? What are you flowing to them? If this is a high risk supplier because they're single source, they're a foreign supplier, they're a distributor that sources from lots of different places. For those higher level of criticality, what are we doing to mitigate that risk? And I expect that we're going to want to see some sort of a risk evaluation done on those vendors and some tools in place.
Absolutely. Now, your newer summary says Clause 9 is not expected to structurally change, but data credibility is going to matter more. It specifically mentions that MSA is referenced alongside Clauses 7 and 8. And that auditors may scrutinize data quality, key performance indicator quality, product safety metrics, operational effectiveness, and of course, supplier performance.
Mm-hmm.
And this connects to something we discussed in episode 1, MSA, APQP, control plans, and the idea that FAI alone does not prove process capability. What does data credibility mean in an aerospace audit?
So I think there's two components to this, and they're both interrelated. So, if we're talking Clause 9, we're primarily talking about our performance evaluation, right? A review of our how we performed against our quality objectives, how we performed in an internal audit, how our management reviewed that data. Some of the things that I think we're likely to see change, and we've already seen a little bit of this, which is interesting. I think now it's just becoming more of a formal requirement. Historically, companies would say, or auditors would say, what are you doing to, or how are you tracking your customer satisfaction? And then, the client will say, well, we're tracking it based on customer complaints, on-time delivery, this, that, and the other thing. And they say, okay, great. What's your goal? What's your numeric value? And they say our goal is 90%. We're scoring 95%. Auditor says, looks great. And we move on. I think now what we're going to see a lot more of is show me how we got there. Let's look at those trends over time. Or if you're evaluating 4 different metrics to come up with your customer satisfaction data, how are you weighing those metrics? Are those 25% each? If they're 25% each, is that based on what your customer thinks is important, right? Mm-hmm. So I bring this up a lot with clients of mine. Customer complaints is one of the requirements. Customer supplier corrective action request is one of the requirements in the RevD standard, and then also on-time delivery, product conformance. If you were to ask your customer doesn't care so much about customer complaints. Your customer cares about on-time delivery, product quality, right? So It would be normal to see those things weighted maybe a little heavier than some of the other things because it's based on the perception to which the customer feels that their needs have been satisfied, right? That's roughly how it's worded in the standard, not 25% this, 25% this, 25% this. It's based on what your customer's interpretation is. And if that's what's important to your customer, then we should be weighing it accordingly. And I expect to see auditors wanting to see some of that justification. If we're doing weighted averages or weighted factors, how are we choosing how those get weighted? And is that really reflective of what's important to the customer or just to satisfy the needs of your QMS? And those are 2 very different things. Now, the other side of that, I use customer satisfaction as an example. I expect that we're going to want to see that front. Things like on-time delivery, things like product quality. We're not going to have to justify our metrics versus just saying our goal was 90, we got 95. I would expect to see some deeper dive questions coming in the standard with some minor tweaks in Clause 9. Now, moving back to the APQP, which is interesting, right? The first article inspection, the production process validation events. This is something that we alluded to in part 1. This is going to become very important, and I think there's going to be a lot of confusion here. There's an inherent problem with the first article inspection. And this is my auditor consultant rant. I apologize. First article inspection it's a great tool, right? As the standard requires, we have to take a I forget exactly how it's worded, but it's like a first representative piece from a production run or something like that to use to prove that the process is capable. And this can be referred to as the first article inspection, which everybody in the industry, I imagine, at this point in time is familiar with the 9102. Mm-hmm. And 9102s are great. The follow-up question from 9102s is, if you were to review a 9102 first article inspection and you asked your quality manager that you might be talking to, was this done using a traditional work traveler that you would see in production? Often the answer is no. This was done as a prototype, in a controlled environment. Okay. Was this done by an operator that is traditionally going to run this in a production environment? No, mm-hmm. It was done by the engineering team. Was this inspected using traditional methods? No, we didn't have the gauging on site, so we used the CMM for everything. So, all of a sudden, the concept of the first article inspection falls apart as a production process validation because you're not actually validating a production process. You validated an isolated event that was overseen by engineering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is an inherent problem with first article inspections. I'm not saying don't do your first article inspections, do your first article inspections. However, there's other components that often get missed when all we're doing is a first article inspection. Then you hear things like APQP and PPAP and MSA and all these buzzword acronyms. And ultimately, acronyms aside, buzzwords aside, I think what we need to do is we need to focus on proving the process versus proving that we made one good part one time. So mm-hmm. I think there's a really approachable step to do this because APQP scares people. That's an old automotive born, validation event that is very cumbersome. It's kind of newer to aerospace. There's some tools out there, but they're daunting tools. But there are ways to do this that are tangible. So I kind of put together a list here of 6 steps that I think that you could use to do a validation event. And I'll go through these real quick. And I think these are really manageable for smaller organizations to be able to do this in bite-sized pieces, if you will. So
Absolutely.
the first thing we need to do is identify what's important. Do we have critical characteristics? Do we have features on there that are more important than others? Those got to be identified on the front. Your second step would be validating under real production conditions. I mentioned this before. Don't be making product in a lab with engineering overseeing it, because that's not a real production event, right? Actually set the product up. I mean, you can do that. And I'm not telling you not to do that. Prototype it out. Absolutely. But also make sure that we're running a representative item from a true production run. So if it's running on machine 5, set it up on machine 5. If Joe, the operator, is the one who's going to run it, have Joe run the product, right? Make it a real life event. Your third step is verifying your measurement method. I mentioned before, maybe we didn't have the tooling in-house to measure it traditionally. We used, a CMM or another method that we're not going to use in a regular production environment. Make sure our tooling is capable of measuring what we needed to. Do a basic gauge R&R. I know I said this during our last episode last year. Do a very basic gauge R&R. Take a couple measurements by a couple different people, a couple different features, and start tracking these things. There's very simple tools online that make that manageable. Your fourth step should be running multiple parts, not just one. Don't just check the first part. I mean, obviously check the first part, but maybe check the 5th part, maybe check the 10th part, right? Let's see how it's trending over time. We talk about things like tooling wear, run out on equipment, also general operator fatigue. If you have a guy who's running this job for 10 hours a day, what does his first hour look like versus what does his last hour look like? We need to gather some data there so we can see how it trends. And if it's trending flat, that's great, but we need to be able to prove that.
Yeah.
Our 5th step here would be monitoring your critical characteristics. This is super important. If critical characteristics are defined by your customer, make sure that we have extremely good data on those critical characteristics that were identified on the front end. And then our last one is to establish our ongoing controls. Once we have all that data, what controls are we going to put in place to make sure that we keep those trends flat, right? That's the goal, is to have the trends be 0. And once we get to that point through our validation event, what are we putting in place to keep those flat long term? And I think those are manageable steps to actually build a program with some defensible evidence that is stronger than first article inspection. A first article is a component of it, but there's more than just a first article. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I think that was a great breakdown. The 6 steps you just ran us through. And I mean, ultimately, the best preparation is probably strengthening controls that you probably needed anyways. All the stuff that you're talking about, it's in theory is what, a continuous improvement should always be working towards. And
absolutely.
But the practical side of things doesn't always play out how it does in theory. I mean, almost like what you were saying in terms of, doing your first article inspection off of, a prototype or something that was, done by the engineering team, not actually taking into account the actual production conditions.
Absolutely.
So no, I think that was a great breakdown. And so to kind of close us out here, if you could leave aerospace companies with one sentence right now, what would that be?
So I was thinking about this. Admittedly, it's going to be 2 sentences. I apologize.
That's it. That's fine.
This is critical as we go into a transition to a new standard, but also this applies to anybody that's currently certified. Your system is only as good as you use it, right? You can have the best system in the world. You can show the best procedures to an auditor. That doesn't make the system good in practice, right? So the use is everything. My second sentence there is that just because it's documented doesn't mean it's implemented. And just because it's implemented doesn't mean it's effective, right? Those things don't always necessarily inherently mean the next. So make sure that what we have in place is true. If we're doing it, it's effective. And if it is effective, that we have evidence to support that.
I think that the 2 sentences, we can waive that requirement, because that we needed 2 sentences there. No, it was called for. And Mike, thank you so much for coming back on the show. We love having you on here.
Happy to be back.
Probably won't be the last time. So, but it's I think it was a very helpful conversation today. Obviously, for anyone that is aerospace, certified or is looking at that, this is between now and beginning to early next year is the beginning of a big transition period for the industry. So I think this information is extremely helpful. The more that we can get out there, the better off everyone will be. So I really appreciate you taking the time to answer my questions as well as you did.
Absolutely. Thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity. And, I always encourage people, to ask the questions, talk to the professionals out there, talk to your peers, talk to your supply chain, talk to your customers. Everybody's going through a version of this, and it's important to kind of collaborate with everybody, because that's what's going to give us the best results.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for any of our listeners that do have additional questions that Mike would be a good resource for, check the show notes. We'll have Mike's information as well as his company's information in the show notes, so you can reach out and speak to Mike if you are looking to. And that's all we've got today. So thank you again, Mike. And until next time, stay compliant.